Well, good to see everyone. I think we can go ahead and get rolling here. It's a little after 9:05. So just a couple comments. I did say, oh, yeah, we are recording. Okay, good. We did say this last week, but I'll say it again, especially for the next 2 weeks, next week and the week after. This is putting us in one of the toughest areas of the Old Testament. When folks start to read through Scripture, this is often the place where they start to get bogged down. We kind of have narrative with a few other things thrown in. We got narrative with genealogies and some things like that thrown in from Genesis up until the middle of Exodus. But then towards the end of Exodus, we start to get all these laws dropped in. And then Leviticus is just a book chock full of laws. It is a book of laws. And then Numbers has a few laws interspersed. So the end of Exodus, all of Leviticus can sometimes make folks bogged down. So let's power through. There's fascinating stuff here. I'll talk in a couple weeks about Leviticus. Well, I'll save that for later. But we'll have some laws today. We'll have more laws from Exodus next week. We'll have a lot of laws from Leviticus the week after. And then Numbers will start picking up some more narrative again. Folks have a much easier time in our culture dealing with narrative. We don't like genealogies. We don't like lots of laws. Fascinatingly, though, in other parts of Christianity these days, genealogies are one of the prized parts of Scripture. In Africa, they love reading the genealogies. They are, African tribal culture, ancestors are important. And so that's one of the most important parts of the Old Testament for them. And the beginnings of Matthew and Luke, those genealogies, they just prize those and really delve into them. Whereas Americans go, more genealogies. So anyway, but laws a little bit this week, some this week, especially the Ten Commandments, more next week, more the week after, but then it'll taper off and we'll get past those sections. So we'll just gird our loins and gear up and just be ready. That's what's going to be happening here. All right. Well, I do have I keep saying one of these days I'm not going to do a PowerPoint, but I keep doing them. So it's just an easier way of kind of organizing some thoughts. So I am going to share. Well, first, before I share screen, cancel out that. Any questions or upfront comments before we kind of dive in? Abby.
Okay, in Exodus 20, when God's giving the 10 commandments and the people at the bottom of Mount Sinai hear the thunder and the trumpet blast and the lightnings and the clouds, do they hear God giving the 10 commandments, or are they just so overwhelmed and scared they hear nothing?
One of the really confusing, I'll probably say a little more about this later, but in case we don't get to it, one of the really confusing things about Moses at Sinai is, where is Moses? Is he up on the mountain? Is he down at the bottom of the mountain? Because he's going back and forth, and because we do have different layers stitched together, it's not always clear exactly where Moses is as far as the final editor is concerned. Sometimes, Moses heads up the mountain, and all of a sudden Moses is heading up the mountain again, taking people with him. Well, it didn't say he came down. You can in some ways, I mentioned last week, and I'll talk about in a second, the TNT Ben Kingsley version of Moses. They actually give the 10 Commandments at the bottom of the mountain. That is an interpretation. You can legitimately say they're at the mountain, and they hear the thunder, and God speaks through Moses literally, and Moses starts ecstatically uttering the 10 Commandments right in front of the people, and they get blown away by it. And, that's when you get the reaction of, oh no, we can't take this. You go up and talk to God and leave us be down here. So it's a good question, Abby, and it is very unclear.
Okay.
So Charlton Heston is up on the mountain clearly in Cecil B. DeMille's version, but the text, you can make various arguments in the text because it is not exactly clear. We don't have one, they didn't blenderize everything. There are some seams. We do have different traditions that are layered up here like a tort. Tort the cake, not tort the legal document, legal concept. So we do have these layers here, and that does make it very complicated. So that's a great question because oftentimes it's very unclear.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I've got John and then Bob.
Yeah, I guess when I thought about this chapter this morning, I was pretty clear what God wanted from the Ten Commandments. But what was it in the contract, in the covenant, what was it that the Israelites wanted from God?
That's an interesting question. Remember, these are uneven contracts. This is, suzerain and vassal, and we'll probably mention that again. We do have, it is uneven. I think in some ways, some of the people, and remember, we haven't talked about this much, but it's going to come up later too. We went through the last part of Exodus so fast. When the people of Israel leave, they are a mixed multitude. There are some other non-Hebrews going with them. And so it's a great question what everybody wants. Well, there are some who are of the family Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and there are some who were probably fellow subjugated neighbors in Egypt that decided, hey, we'll throw our lot. If they're leaving, we'll get out of Dodge with them and take that opportunity to leave ourselves. Just like Thanksgiving's coming up in a month, the pilgrims were only about, the Mayflower was only about 50-55% pilgrims. The other part were the so-called strangers who were not part of the Puritan colony. They kind of threw in their lot with the Puritans, but there was tension. There was tension at Christmas time in Plymouth because the strangers wanted to celebrate Christmas, and the pilgrims, being hardcore Puritans, said, no, it's December 25th is a regular day. It's not on a Sunday, so we're not going to celebrate anything. Get to work. Get out there and keep working. So we have that same kind of tension there. So what do the people want? I think in some ways, the people are not sure what they want. God wants them to be his people. He wants to be their God. But it doesn't seem that people are always looking for that. I think they want to be taken care of. They want to be fed. They want to be watered. I make them sound like plants. They want care in the desert. They're given a promise of being taken into the promised land. So they'll get a nation. But other than that, I don't think they're, at this point, really in it for lots else. You got us out of Egypt, great. We're on the move to somewhere better, great. Now, why are we taking this detour to this mountain? Why does Moses have to go talk to God? I'm not sure there's a hardcore desire amongst all the people for intimate, deep relationship with this God of Israel. And part of the theme of Exodus is the you will know theme. Part of the dealings with Pharaoh is so that Pharaoh would know who this God is, so that the gods of Egypt would know who this God is. He got his people broken out of slavery. But part of the rest of the theme of Exodus is so that the people of Israel themselves will start to know and learn who their God is. You can almost think of this as almost like the infancy of the nation here. Really, Sinai is almost like the nursery. They stay a year there, and then they're kind of toddlers wandering in the wilderness with God. And then maybe they're elementary school kids when they start to go into the promised land. You can kind of think of some of those kind of things. And then they're rebellious teenagers, and well, they do the terrible twos here a lot in the wilderness. But anyway, push the metaphor too far. But they're not highly developed as a religious culture at this point. They're going to have to learn a lot of things. Great question too. Bob, you had a question.
Well, a couple of things just real quick. First, where the heck does Joshua come from? I mean, he's like the second most important human in the Pentateuch, or certainly in Exodus forward. And unlike everybody else, there is no genealogy for him, not here. It's just that he's just introduced as a brand new character in the by the showrunner, so to speak, and he's really, really significant, but we get no backstory whatsoever from him,
Right?
Which is odd.
Yeah, I mean, Cecil B. DeMille goes to great lengths to introduce us to Joshua, but Exodus does not. And Joshua, in some ways, really doesn't. He comes up some in Exodus and has some minorly important roles, but his importance will really increase in the book of Numbers. That's when he'll start to, he'll really start speaking up on behalf of God. He'll become Moses' heir apparent towards the end of Numbers, and of course, 2 books later, then Book of Joshua, he leads the people in. But he does he's not. We don't get the full backstory. We're still focusing on Moses and Moses' brother Aaron and Moses' sister Miriam, very importantly. Trey, you got your hand up.
Isn't Joshua, though, isn't that the same name as Jesus?
Yeshua, yeah. is Jesus. It's funny. We Anglos in West Texas will often say, "Oh, how could Hispanic folks name their kid Jesus, Jesus?" We name kids Joshua all the time, and we don't think a thing of it. No difference. Same name, different iterations of it. So, good observation. Yeah, Bob.
Real quick, speaking about Jesus, the other thing I was thinking about, the discussion of manna, and I can't remember if it's later in Exodus or into one of the other books. There's actually a recipe how to prepare manna.
But you talk about
grind it, roll it, bake it, all that stuff.
Pound it, yeah.
The commentary early in the chapter in book 701, where people are trying to discover, well, is it the secretion of some desert lice? And I appreciate what the author says, that, assume it's a miracle and just move forward. But, there's so many, I think there are a lot of scholars, there's a whole scholarly tradition of people trying to naturalize and rationalize all of the Bible to the natural world. And, I know obviously as a Jews don't believe in Christ, but I mean, if you can believe in the central tenet of Christianity, that God became man, came down, crucified, died, raised from the dead, if you can believe that, why do you not believe everything else? I know it's not literal, I'm not a literalist, but I mean, why do you have to say, well, was it the Reed Sea or the Red Sea? Why, anyway.
Part of it, and this is part of what, there was a thrust to do this in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century until really kind of the last quarter of the 20th century amongst biblical scholars to really try to find natural explanations. If you go the natural explanation route, then you have to bring up the question of timing, because the timing is awfully important. The original audience, these folks were not worried about giving natural explanations. That's something that our post-Enlightenment rationalism really wants to have. And it's possible that there's some tree secretions. It's possible there's some insect secretions. Could be. But again, timing and consistency, and they're not always going to be in Sinai. There aren't those trees everywhere, and you're probably not walking on a carpet of those insects continually. Sinai is a pretty bleak desert. So I think we're supposed to see it as bread from heaven, which is what the intent of Exodus is, and certainly the way it's portrayed in the Gospel of John as well. Jesus is the new manna, the new bread from heaven. So it's good, Bob. I think we're dealing with Enlightenment stuff here, Enlightenment philosophy. You got to have a rational explanation for everything, and the pendulum can swing various ways. You don't want to see. It's not a miracle every time the sun comes up. The earth does pivot on its axis, and it'll happen every day. It doesn't take a special act of God, and yet God undergirds all of creation. All those processes are, God is the source of being. Anyway, we could go down some other roads there, but good questions all. All right, well, I'm gonna start screen sharing here and pop up this PowerPoint. Here we go. All right. So we're still here in the Moses epic. And as I said last week, that's the predominant story in the Old Testament, the foundational core narrative for the Jewish people, and very important for Christians as well. And I said last week, it's about a sixth of the Old Testament. That's a huge chunk. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy make up about a sixth of the Old Testament. David, Isaiah, nobody else comes close to this Moses number of pages here. I did say, first off, we are getting a lot of laws, so let's not get bogged down. Don't have to rehash that. All right, and just we are going to hit the Ten Commandments in the later part of this section, the law, and a reminder, the other term is the Decalogue, the 10 words. That's more of a Jewish term. And Decalogue is I guess a Latin, or I guess, is that Latin or Greek? I guess it'd be Greek. Probably a Latinized Greek form of that. The 10 words is the way we think of that. And we still use that liturgically as our title. You may not know this because in the old days, if you went to an Episcopal Eucharist, Episcopal Communion service, or Church of England Communion service, you would have to say the Ten Commandments at the beginning of the service every Sunday. One of the things they did to make things easier, instead of reciting all 10 commandments, they said, and we still do this at 8 o'clock, instead of reciting all 10 commandments, the priest can say the summary of the law. This is the first, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, all mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's a replacement for saying the 10 commandments. But we could still say it. If you really get hungry for doing this every week, we could do it. It's in the prayer book. And it's in the prayer book before Rite 1 on page 317, 318, the Decalogue, in Rite 1 language, the old language. But there's also a Rite 2 version, a little bit shorter, less wordy, on page 350. And again, we're calling it the Decalogue because that's very important. The 10 words from God. We did say there are some other forms of these 10 words. We won't go into all that right now. We may get to that later. One thing I did want to mention, though, is how central this is. We don't think of this as so important these days. It's not as central to our Christian life. It's not as central to our Christian piety. We don't make our kids memorize the 10 Commandments like previous generations did. And yet, remember, this is the picture on the front of the book. This is, Chagall's giving of the law. Hugely important idea for Jewish folks. Most Jewish synagogues will either have a picture of the burning bush or they'll have a picture of the tablets of stone, or oftentimes both. But one thing you may not know, unless you visit a lot of Episcopal churches or Anglican churches, Church of England churches from the 16 and 1700s, every blasted one of them will have posted the 10 Commandments. It's on the wall, tablets of stone here. This is right above the altar in this particular English church. Sometimes it's next to the altar on the wall, but here they are. Exodus chapter, verse, and here are all the commandments written out there. Because in the 16 and 1700s, in our tradition, this was hugely important. You needed to learn, know, read, mark, learn, inwardly digest these commandments. Probably more than any other part of the Old Testament, these were the important thing. I mean, nowadays we think of these maybe as more historical or more, this is the foundation of law, like the Code of Hammurabi, and Moses' 10 Commandments are the foundation of the law. You often see those on the Supreme Court building and inscriptions and things like that, the history of law. But for our ancestors, our Protestant ancestors in the faith, this was important just because it was God's command. It was a summary, they thought, of law. Renee is texting me. Renee, if you can hear me, I have no idea what that text was cryptic. I have no idea what that means.
See, Bob had a question in the chat. Was always trying to.
Sorry. Go ahead, Bob. I didn't see it because you weren't popped up. I only get to see 5 people or 6 people, 5 other people, 4 people. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if the 10 Commandments are as significant to Islam.
No, they're not. They are important, but they're not as significant. Islam really does have a hierarchical structure. The Torah, the law, is important. But then God comes and brings the gospel with the great prophet Jesus, or Isa, and that's even more important. But then God comes yet one more time and has the full revelation with the greatest prophet in their view, Muhammad.
Dad,
So there is a layering up there. Yeah, Jimmy, go ahead.
wanted to bet on that note. I don't think that the 10 Commandments per se are part of it, but a lot of times, a lot of the laws from the Torah were put into I can't remember what the word is, Sharia law, and so they reused a lot of those and moved them around. The other thing too that I'll just quickly mention is that Moses is the most mentioned person in the Quran, period, by verse.
Wow.
Not in one narrative, but it is over the entire Quran. He is mentioned more, and his stories are more a larger portion of the Quran than anybody else, including or Jesus. Muhammad's almost never mentioned because he's the one reciting it. But but Moses is a huge player in the Quran. So
It's very, very helpful info, Jimmy. Thank you so much. That's so not only the Old Testament, the predominant mention, but also the Quran. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we don't have at St. Paul's, even though we're a colonial, neo-colonial architecture church, if you go back to churches that look like St. Paul's back east that were built in the 1700s, look, Christ Church Alexandria, or Christ Church Philadelphia, or Bruton Parish Williamsburg, you'll find those 10 Commandments tablets on the wall. We do have them at St. Paul's, but they're a little more sketchy at St. Paul's. On the back door, right over the back door, we do have the tablets of stone. And they've got Roman numerals, not even written out, but we've still got it. And we've got the Ark of the Covenant, at least the European version of the Ark of the Covenant. We'll talk more about that next week. But again, this is important in our culture. You've got the great Cecil B. DeMille movie that really forms our ideas of all this. You've got, I mentioned that Ben Kingsley movie. I would give that a good thumbs up to see sometime. Not as splashy, not as much of a spectacle as Cecil B. DeMille, a little more realistic. The Egyptians have fancy palaces, but they're not that fancy. They look kind of like adobe instead of everything's gold and shiny. So it's a good thing to rent or to find Ben Kingsley's Stream, Ben Kingsley's Moses, made by TNT originally. Also, there's not a bad cartoon that came out in the early O's. Prince of Egypt, done by Steven Spielberg with his DreamWorks crew. A great cast, a great voice cast. Martin Short and Steve Martin are the two Egyptian priests, and they're just wonderful in that. But you've got some other great folks. And the music is by Stephen Schwartz, great Episcopalian. He originally wrote Godspell, pulled many of the lyrics out of the Episcopal hymnal of the time, the 1940 hymnal, and probably best known now for being the author of Wicked and the music for that. So some good tunes in Prince of Egypt. By the way, Val Kilmer stars as Moses and Ralph Fiennes as Ramses in this. They did make a Val Kilmer musical for stage. I actually have never seen it. It's gotten mediocre reviews. It came out in the early O's, and I just couldn't resist. So Renee, tomorrow Amazon is going to be delivering a copy of the DVD of Val Kilmer as Moses in 10 Commandments the musical. So we're going to be the proud owners. But they've also got a Prince of Egypt musical that was a smash hit in London in February, and then they had to stop because of COVID. So we'll see how good that is as time develops. So we do have this part of our culture. It really is a part of our culture in various ways, even today in pop culture, even in 2020, on stage in London. All right, we'll kind of segue off that. Last time I put this slide up, various paths for the Exodus, and talking about Yom Suf and the Sea of Reeds. And oops, I've got an umlaut instead of a tent over the U. Well, that's incorrect, but we'll ignore that. Probably the more traditional route is kind of this pinkish or reddish line. But part of what goes into the importance of how they got out of Egypt is where they're going. And so there's a lot of discussion about where Mount Sinai is. Now, there is a Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula called Mount Sinai, Jebel Musa. That's the traditional Mount Sinai. But over the years, there have been a number of mountains, not only in the Sinai Peninsula, but also in the Arabian Peninsula, that have been proposed as theoretical places of Mount Sinai. So there's a raft of theories out there. This is the traditional site down here. If you're really interested in this question, last year, Jimmy and I went to a lecture at LCU, a linear lecture. You can find this on YouTube. I pulled this up. It is an hour and a half. It's about an hour and 10 minutes with 20 minutes of questions. But it's actually a very good lecture. It's a biblical archaeologist who does a lot of work in Egypt. And he goes through the cases for all these mountains biblically and tries to figure out which one's the real Mount Sinai. And he also asks, why does it matter? And we'll get to that in a second. And he actually eliminates most of them except for the ones down here in the south. He says it's probably one of these ones in the south and may very well be the traditional one, that actually really may be the predominant one. That's what he makes the case for. But he also makes the case, why does it matter? And he says basically it doesn't. Once the law was given and once they set up the tabernacle, which we'll talk about next week, Moses never goes up on Mount Sinai again, and no one else does except for the prophet Elijah later on. So Sinai is kind of a one-time shot in the history of the people of Israel. They don't keep going back there. They don't set up a temple there. It's a one-time shot, and then they move away from it and leave it behind. And so from that standpoint, he says, it really doesn't matter. It's interesting historically. It's an important place historically, but it's not the place you keep returning to, because the people of Israel didn't. Having said that, there's a Christian monastery there. We'll talk about that. But that's Mount Sinai, a very rugged desert in the Sinai Peninsula. Much more rugged than lots of parts of New Mexico or Arizona. Not a lot of saguaro cactuses or anything, a few tufts of grass. This Christian monastery, it's only been there about half the time since Moses went up the mountain. It dates back to the 500s. So this ancient Christian monastery there at the foot of this mountain that's been there for almost 1,500 years now. They'll be celebrating their 1,500th anniversary later this century. St. Catherine's Monastery, by the way, this beautiful monastery, this is on my bucket list. I've never gotten to see this. I would like to see it sometime. But they also are famous because they had, it's gone now, but it's been moved. But they had, in the 1800s, the second oldest copy of the Bible was discovered here in this library of this monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai out here in the desert. It's called the Codex Sinaiticus. And by Bible, I mean the Christian Bible. Dead Sea Scrolls have some older copies of Jewish Old Testament books. But the Codex Sinaiticus, 200 years older than the monastery, but somehow they got it and they held on to it until the 1900s. And then it got shipped off. Most of it's now in London, but some of it's scattered around in Germany and some other places. They split up the Codex. Codex, by the way, is just a book. Codex is kind of a high-tech scroll that they took the scroll and they started folding and cutting it, and they kind of layered the pages up in a stack instead of having them in a long strip. And it was a brilliant innovation at the time. We say, yeah, it's a book. Well, somebody had to invent that kind of arrangement. And it's much easier to open leaves that are sequential like that and find your place than it is to roll out a scroll and try to go through things. So that's what a codex is. And
Jim?
This is a Greek codex, Greek Old Testament and Greek New Testament, mostly complete. There are a few things missing. Yeah, Becky.
Just as a point of interest, John just reminded me that Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, which are the old ruins many of us have seen, are at the same era, same time period, 6th century, as at St. Catherine's Monastery, which you just showed.
I hadn't made that connection. Yeah, Chaco. Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, like Chaco Canyon, beautiful place. So if you're curious, so this is the second oldest copy we have of the Bible, from the 330s, roughly, give or take. The oldest copy is maybe 10, 20, 30 years older. It's called the Vatican Codex, the Codex Vaticanus. And there are a couple other old Bibles too that are very important for scholarly work. This was a game changer. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls were a game changer in the 2000s or in the 1900s. Finding this codex and the Codex Vaticanus, rediscovering that was hugely important in the 1800s to say there's another old Bible here. All right, probably too many digressions here. Well, let's dive into our section here. So this section of Exodus is the people on the way from Sinai. They've crossed the Sea of Reeds and they go down the Sinai Peninsula and they get to Mount Sinai, wherever that is. Unless it happens to be in Arabia, then they have to cross the Sinai Peninsula and go into Midian and go into Arabia. And the Muslims actually love those theories. They very much think that Saudi Arabia has the real Mount Sinai, not that Egyptian spot, over across the Gulf of Aqaba. They think they've got the real thing. But the book mentions something I won't spend a lot of time on, but there are things called parallelisms or inclusios. You can think of them as brackets that start cropping up here. That's very important literarily. They're used in the Gospels. They're used in the book of Revelation. They're used in a lot of Old Testament books. if you don't have chapter and verses, if you're learning things by ear, inclusios or brackets or parallelisms are ways of framing stories by having similar things being said or happening on either side of something in the middle. And it kind of says the stuff in the middle is very important. It's a way of kind of framing and drawing your attention to that. Sometimes they're very short, within a few verses of each other. Sometimes they're spread out. So these inclusios here, we have water from a rock, and we have battling Amalekites that are split between Exodus 17 and Numbers 14 and Numbers 20. So the stuff important is being highlighted. The giving of the law at Mount Sinai in Exodus and Leviticus is being highlighted and bracketed by these things happening on either side. So that time at Sinai is very, very important. Revelation, if you ever look at Revelation, Jesus says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega. God says, I'm the Alpha and Omega twice in chapter 1. And then again, they each say it in chapter 1, and they each say it at the last of the book too. And so these things, we could go off on a lot of tangents on that. But that's a pattern that starts here that'll become important in a lot of Jewish and Christian scriptures later. Your book did spend a fair amount of time on this. I won't spend much time on this, but the covenant, we've found a lot of ancient treaties since archaeologically in recent centuries that biblical scholars are being able to work with now, and that's been very helpful. And they're called suzerainty or suzerainty treaties. That word, I have heard it pronounced with either the word suzerain or suzerain. I've heard pronounced with 2 syllables and 3 syllables, and I've heard each syllable pronounced differently. I've heard emphases on each different syllable. So you may hear it by scholars all kinds of different ways. It's not a word we use in English a lot, but usually I hear suzerain or suzerain from scholars, but there are some variations. So suzerainty treaty, unequal treaty between a king, a suzerain, a ruler, and vassals down below. So this is not a treaty between 2 equal countries. This is an unequal treaty, a hierarchical treaty. Now, it is still a covenant. Each side agrees to do things for the other side, yet it's not equal. And very much the law at Sinai follows all these, or many of these patterns from these other treaties we have evidence of from the Middle East. All right. So far, so good. Any thoughts or questions here? Well, I do want to say just a quick word of overview here of what this section is about, and then we'll see if we might have time to dive into a couple texts here. Our book really focused on 16 through 24. I would say we want to start actually this section with the middle of chapter 15. There is some purification of some bitter waters, and there are a couple stays at oases as they're heading down to Mount Sinai. Then we get the narrative of manna and quail in the desert. Again, we'll get those in Numbers. By that point, people are sick of eating manna. They're complaining about the lack of variety. They're complaining also here. But God sustains them miraculously with food in the desert, with manna, with quail, and with waters. Purifying bitter waters up here, and then drawing water from the rock in chapter 17. Water is essential in the desert. And if you're not staying at an oasis, then you need water somewhere else. And so God provides for his people. God sustains them in this brutal, barren landscape. There is an early war here. Before we even get to Mount Sinai, we have the first of several battles that the Israelites will fight. The Hebrews will fight in the Sinai before they get to the Promised Land. There'll be a lot of them later on, but we get one here with the Amalekites. It also has the narration about Moses is getting tired, and so got to hold his arms up and keep him praying. Chapter 18, we have Jethro visit. There also is a inclusio with this. Jethro will visit later at the other end of the Sinai story. And Moses delegates some decisions, and Moses will spread out some power in a different way in Numbers as well. So we have some bracketing here as well. But then we finally do get to Mount Sinai. And there are all kinds of, God talks about purifying the folks and, abstain from sexual behavior, and get yourself ready. I'm coming down the mountain. I'm going to manifest myself. There's going to be a theophany. We've had that word in previous chapters, a God manifestation, a God exhibiting. God is going to self-reveal himself on Mount Sinai to his people. And it'll be a real sound and light show. I mean, smoke and fire and thunder and trumpets blowing and the whole 9 yards. A Kiss rock concert has nothing on Mount Sinai with God coming down on it. At Mount Sinai, we got the 10 Commandments given, chapter 20. As Abby asked, who are they given to? Is it given to all the folks? Is it given to Moses up on the mountain? Again, that's a great question. You can make different arguments. Well, one piece of trivia, if you remember the 10 Commandments tablets from the movie that Moses has, they actually carved those on polished Mount Sinai granite or rock or whatever it was. They actually took Cecil B. DeMille sent off to Mount Sinai, sent his crew out there to get some rock from Mount Sinai, and they polished it up and made those movie props out of Mount Sinai rock. So that was important to Cecil B. DeMille. But anyway, we've got the 10 Commandments given. It's interesting. There are all kinds of, this is trivia and off the subject. You see in art, sometimes you see 3 on one tablet and 7 on the other. You sometimes see 4 and 6 on the 2 tablets. The Jewish tradition is actually, sometimes you see 5 and 5. The Jewish tradition is 10 and 10. You've got a set and a spare set. It's actually, both sets have all the 10 Commandments on them in Jewish, some rabbinical stories and traditions. So you see them in art separated many different ways, sometimes 10 and 10, sometimes 5 and 5, sometimes 3 and 7, sometimes 4 and 6. Part of the break is, what if you have 2 tablets and you're not splitting them evenly, what laws apply to God, what laws apply to the people? And that's often the way they're divided. St. Paul's, if you notice, we have 3 on one and 7 on the other. That's a reading. If you look at the commandments, you've got having no other gods in front of me or in my face or before me, not making an idol, not invoking God's name in vain or in malice. And then you've got all these people laws, honor your father and mother, don't commit murder, adultery, steal, false witness. And then the Sabbath day is often the hinge one that people disagree on. Is that a God rule or is that a people rule? And so sometimes you see 3 and 7. Sometimes you see this made added to the God side and these to the people side. So that's why we have that 3 and 7 on the St. Paul's tablet.
Dad?
Yes, son.
Also, the Catholics, I think, number them differently from the Protestants, and I'm not sure about where the Jewish numbering is, but
I should have put that up. There's actually, I think there's a chart at the end of the chapter on that, isn't there? They
I can't remember.
yeah. Let me just, yeah. I read through this several weeks back. Yeah. So in your book on page, if you have a book, it's on page 118. They do a full breakdown here of the different numbering for Jewish, Orthodox, and Protestant. Interesting, the Orthodox and Protestant are together on that. That doesn't often happen. And Catholic, Anglican, and Lutheran have different numbering. So what we consider part of the first commandment, the Jews put as part of a separate second commandment, and they lump some stuff together later. We lump together coveting later on at the very end. They split that out. So there are some different arrangements there. So thank you, Jimmy. That's thank you for reminding me of that. That's good. So not only how we put them on 2 different tablets, but how we arrange the verses themselves. Because if you, well, let's go ahead and just get through real quick here, and then we'll go back to that because we have time. So chapter 21 through 23, some other laws are given. The book will focus in on this chunk of laws next week, and so we'll just kind of skip over that. And then in 24, the covenant is sealed. The people accept the covenant. They accept the terms of it. They say, okay, well, we will enter into this covenant with God, and they seal it by taking some elders up. And again, we have various traditions. The elders, well, let's go ahead and let me pull the scripture text up here, and we'll go backwards. So let's move you all here. Actually, I'm gonna move you over here. Okay. So down in 24, Moses goes up the mountain at the end. God's glory comes. Moses goes on the cloud. But he's also got another invitation here where you've got Joshua coming up, Moses' assistant, and says for the elders to wait with Aaron and Hur. But before that, these elders, 70 elders, so you've got several traditions kind of stitched together here. They actually go up and they see God on the mountain, which is fascinating. And under God's feet is something like a blue, shiny sapphire stone, lapis lazuli stone, maybe some kind of very, very amazing manifestation of God. And God allowed the people, these chieftains, these leaders, to see him. Now, God doesn't always allow people to see him, and there are different traditions about that. Later on in Exodus 33, Moses asked to see God, and God says, no, you can't handle it, you can't see my face. So this is a different tradition, different strand than that. Later in 33, you get the story. God says, well, you can't handle it. I'll tell you what, hide in this cliff, look, put your face in this cleft in the rock, and I'll pass by with all my glory, and I'll hold my hand over the cleft in the rock, and then after I pass by, you can take a peek of my backside, but you're not going to be able to see me front on and live. So we've got different traditions here, just like we have in the Genesis stories. God walks in the garden in Genesis 2 and 3 and talks intimately with Adam and Eve. God in chapter 1 is a much more powerful heavenly God that stands off from afar and creates from a distance. And so we've got some of those traditions that work themselves into the Mount Sinai stories as well. So chapter 24, the covenant is ratified by the elders going up, by the people saying, yep, we'll do it. And they offer some sacrifice. Blood is dashed against an altar and everything. And the people say, yep, we agree. Whatever God says, we will do it. Of course, they don't. Later on, we'll get the story of the golden calf next time. But at least they intend to at that point. Let's jump up here real quick. So any thoughts or questions there? Close to time here. Yeah, Jimmy, were you going to say something? Okay. I saw you lunging towards your screen there. Okay. So chapter 20, if you ever want to look, this is the original form of the Ten Commandments. There are some variations. There's another variation on this later, and there's also a different set of 10 words that God gives later in the Pentateuch as well. But this is the classic form here. So part of the discussion is whether these early verses here are prologue or are they part of the commandment. One thing, it's we read the first commandment here. You shall have no other gods before me, and that kind of strikes us as a little odd because we think God is the only God, and later on the Jewish people will certainly believe that. But at this point, they think God is the number one God amongst all the other gods. And so God is saying you don't have any other gods that you put in front of me in priority. It also has a wonderful connotation too. It also means in my face. Keep your other gods out of my face. I don't even want to see your other gods. Don't have them. Don't bring them into my temple. Don't bring them into your house. Don't worship them. Keep them away. I don't want them in my face. I don't want them being worshipped in any kind of priority with me. I don't share anything with them. So interesting there. Don't make idols. That is one of the things that really separates out Judaism and then later Islam, and to a lesser extent Christianity. The Muslims think we have way too many statues and pictures of God and Jesus and things like that, as Western Christians and Eastern Christians too, with iconography. Muslim art is very abstract because of that. Jewish art is often abstract too. You don't see a lot of pictures of Moses in the synagogue unless they're really influenced by Western artists. It's more symbolic. Tablets of stone, burning bushes, things like that. But don't have idols. That really does separate us out. We also have this wonderful this word hesed, steadfast love, that starts cropping up here and will be very important in the Torah. That God over and over again shows this hesed, So I may punish you to the third and fourth generation, but my love will go to the 1000th generation. And so if there's a carrot and stick, the carrot is much more powerful here than the stick is. Yeah, God punishes people in the old. We think of God as the God of wrath in the Old Testament sometimes and use that as a caricature, but God's love, God's mercy, God's loving kindness, his steadfast love is for 1,000 generations. And so much more important here in the law. Okay, don't use the name of God wrong. Don't make an oath falsely, basically, is what that means. Remember the Sabbath day, and that's important to the priests later on. Huge marker of Judaism is keeping Sabbath. And then things that most of us would agree on. Okay, yeah, it's not good to steal. It's not good to commit adultery. Not good to murder. Not good to lie in court. And not good to covet other things. And so, here was Abby's question. So, at the end of chapter 20 here, the people witness the thunder, lightning, the sound of the trumpet, the mountain smoking. They're afraid and they stand at distance. And they say, you speak to us and we'll listen, but don't let God speak to us or we'll die. So does that mean they just heard this? Or have they just heard God's voice giving it to Moses on the mountain? Again, that is a great question, and the text is not really, really clear. But we do have the people from this point on kind of standing off and Moses being more of the intermediary. The other wonderful thing here is that God is often appearing in this thick darkness in the Old Testament. We think of God revealing himself, and he does, and yet God reveals himself from cloud and darkness, and he's in the midst of that. And so we get to know God, but we don't get to know all of God because we can't comprehend it. We can't take in the totality of who God is. And so there is revelation here. At the same time, there is protection from God by clouds and thick darkness. There is stuff that we're not able to see in the midst of all this. So lots of great stuff here. We don't have time to do much else here. I'll stop the screen at this point. Thoughts or questions here? Yeah, Jimmy.
Oh, I was just gonna make it. You talked a lot about the Protestant side of the Ten Commandments being so important, but even in the medieval church with the Catholics, you could get in a lot of the sins were actually attributed to the Ten Commandments, and even honoring your father and mother was taken to be theologically that you had to obey everyone that was in authority over you, and if you didn't, then you were that was a mortal sin, and you could get in real trouble for that, and sometimes legally too. But it was hugely important all across Christianity, not just later on in the Protestant church.
It is interesting. I mean, we Christians, the Jewish people don't put as much emphasis on the Ten Commandments because they were trying to keep all the laws of the Torah. We Christians have kind of glommed onto these because we think Jesus has overturned. The book of Hebrews talks about overturning ceremonial laws. We don't have to keep kosher. We don't have to sacrifice animals in the temple. We don't have to throw blood on an altar anymore because Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. But we still keep the distinction we make, and you can see this in the Catechism and in the early documents of the Anglican Church. We keep the moral commandments. Okay, the ceremonial commandments, the ritual commandments, we have let go of, but the moral commandments, how to be in relationship to God and to each other, those we say are still binding on Christians. And the Ten Commandments being so tied up with these moral commandments, that really is one of the reasons we glommed onto these, because it's a great summary of the kind of thing we've hung on to from the law, whereas we've let go of the ritual parts and things. Any other questions here, thoughts? Well, next week we'll still be at Mount Sinai, and the week after that we'll still be at Mount Sinai. We'll get some more laws. Next week we'll get all the instructions about the tabernacle and talk about how important that is as a precursor to the temple, and get into that. And then we'll look at the book of Leviticus after that. And then November 15th we'll get to leave Mount Sinai and start wandering in the wilderness and head to the promised land. So gird up your loins, as I said, 2 more weeks of law, and maybe Trey will really enjoy this part, and Bob. The lawyers, I think of lawyers' offices with all those law books on you. Okay. So hopefully y'all will enjoy this. But there's some good stuff here. So we'll still find good stuff in the midst of what to Americans might be a little dry or esoteric. So hang in there. We'll power through all this. All right, y'all. Well, great to see you, and we'll pick up there next time. Abby, have fun with the cattle.
Thanks, Jim.
Mimi, stay warm in South Dakota.
It's snowing.
Oh, we're going to get that same front, I'm afraid. Y'all take care.